Hello and welcome to Other Voices, brought to you by Peninsula Peace and Justice Center. I'm your host, Paul George. The renowned poet Robert Frost once observed, quote, "A bank is a place where they lend you an umbrella in fair weather and ask for it back when it begins to rain." Tonight we're going to take a look at a growing movement around the country, even around the world actually, that is trying to change that definition of banks by promoting public as opposed to private banks. And both of my guests tonight are actively and have for a long time been actively involved in that movement. I'd like to welcome first directly to my right here, Tom Sgouros. Tom is a senior researcher in the Just Public Finance program of the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society at UC Berkeley and a visiting scientist at the Brown University Computer Science Department in Rhode Island, where he lives. Tom, welcome to Other Voices.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming down. Thanks for coming down from Rhode Island to join us. And at the far end of the table, Susan Harman is a co-founder of Commonomics USA, an organization that envisions a world where a commons-based economy creates economic and ecological security for all. Susan is also a member of Friends of the Public Bank of Oakland, which we will be learning more about as we go along. Susan, welcome to you, and thank you for coming down.
Thank you.
And I want to thank Susan and the fine folks at the South Bay Progressive Alliance for helping me put together this program tonight. Found out through them that Tom was in town for something else. He's one of the leading experts, I think, on public banking. I even read your book. I must say the chapter on balance sheets almost killed me, but but I made it through.
So, you seem to have survived.
Yeah. So I want to start to try to get this, because I think public banking is going to be a new idea to a lot of people here. And I want to start kind of where your book starts, with how you got involved in this, going back 20 years in Rhode Island, when Rhode Island kind of had its own little banking crisis that you found yourself in the middle of.
Yeah, we did. In 1991, the new governor was inaugurated after his third attempt running for office, and within an hour of inauguration, he had to close 45 small banks and credit unions in the state. About a third of the bank deposits in the state were frozen for many months, including mine.
Meaning you couldn't get your money out.
I could not get my money out, and it was a disaster. It was pretty funny. It was brought on by the failure of a small bank. This was a $24 million bank, a very small bank. The bank president had embezzled $14 million of the $24 million.
Making it that much smaller.
Which I got to believe is some kind of record in terms of percentage.
Yeah.
But the little insurance fund, which was a private insurance fund, the little insurance fund that insured these 45 banks was not up to the... Oh, it turned out he was a vice president of the insurance fund, too.
How convenient.
Yes, exactly.
But this is part of the problem that we're looking at with private banks, is this interknitting of wealthy interests.
Although that was one of the last remaining private bank insurance arrangements in the country. There are a handful still around, I think, but mostly they're all subsumed. Mostly they've all been taken place by the FDIC or the National Credit Union NCUA administration.
So that somebody's really keeping an eye on it.
Yeah, things are a little more secure than it was then. But the result is that I became a banking analyst sort of in a hurry.
Yeah.
Because
to get your money out of the bank.
I was doing public policy work for people, for state legislators and lobby groups in the area, and what I was doing for them was sort of the nerdy chores, looking at the budget and things like that. And suddenly there's a big issue of public finance, and that is well, it fit right into the nerdy chores. So yeah.
Have Tom go learn about banks.
So I did. Yep.
All right, and you've been at it ever since, and came across this concept of public banking. And
Yeah. Well, I actually circulated a proposal then in 1981 that the state should just take over those banks and run them, because they closed, but they weren't all. There were 45 of them that were closed, but there were only about 3 or 4 of them that were a real problem. But they all got tarred with the same brush, and it seemed to me a no-brainer for the state to just say, look, we'll just run it. We'll stand behind them. We'll guarantee the deposits. We'll do it. And I thought, wow, this is a way that the state could free itself from the bond market forever, by having this, the ability to borrow from these banks instead of from the bond market.
Yeah.
But I could not get we couldn't get any traction in the legislature.
This is the way the banking industry works, isn't it? I mean,
It is.
even in Rhode Island, it's not Wall Street. There's one other story you tell near the beginning of your book where that I think is a good expose of some of the problems that can mount up for local communities, and that's the one of the Philadelphia school system.
Oh, right. Yep.
Yeah, go through that quickly. And I'm just kind of laying the groundwork for why we would want public banks.
The Philadelphia school system, along with a number of other public agencies, cities and towns across the country, was persuaded to do an interest rate swap with banks. Basically, they had.
Yeah, you better explain interest rate swap a little bit.
They were in debt. They were in debt with floating rate debt. They wanted fixed rate debt. The banks had fixed rate debt. They wanted, and so basically it was, I'll pay your mortgage if you pay my mortgage. And why would you do that? The issue is that, oh, you have a fixed rate mortgage. I'd prefer a fixed rate mortgage. I have a floating rate mortgage. You're willing to take the risk for that. So they swapped payments. And then what happened? So now Philadelphia is paying fixed rate debt, and and
this is for their schools, right?
For the Philadelphia School Department is paying a fixed rate.
Yeah.
Right, and the banks are paying a floating rate. The next thing that happened was that the interest rates dived down to near zero, but Philadelphia is still paying 5%.
Because now they've got a fixed rate.
Because now they got the fixed rate.
If they kept the floating rate, their payments would have gone down.
And the thing about the banks, people talk about how it's just exchanging debt, but that's actually not true, because the banks were funding that. The banks were taking that debt and they were making it to use floating rate loans. So for the bank, both sides floated. So the banks did the swap in order to extinguish risk, but the Philadelphia school system took on quite a bit of interest rate risk. And when interest rates went way down, they were left holding the bag, owing this money on fixed rate debt. And they went to the banks and said, look, you're going to break us. We can't afford this. This is not the bargain we made. And the banks essentially said, a deal's a deal.
Yeah.
And
this had real world impact in the classrooms, right?
Oh, yeah. Teachers were laid off. All the aides in the school system were laid off. It was devastating to them. But appeals to the decency of the people who held the debt were unavailing about.
It's very politely.
Shall we say that?
Yes, yeah. We could probably go on. Everybody knows horror stories about banks.
I wrote an article called "Predatory Public Finance" about exactly that kind of thing. It has a number of examples. People can Google that.
Yeah. Okay. Predatory public finance.
Exactly.
Okay. Look it up. Susan, let me turn to you and give us a broad definition of what a public bank is and why it wouldn't cause these kinds of problems.
I can give you a very short definition.
I'm sure you've got it all settled out, but get us started that way. Let's start talking about
the point of a public bank is that it's owned by the public, by the people of a jurisdiction or a combination of jurisdictions. and its motivation, its mission is public good rather than profit. That's basically the definition.
Do you want to
Yeah.
add anything to that, or?
No, I think that's exactly right. I mean, the idea is that there are important public policy goals that are accomplished through finance. And if you want those goals to be accomplished by an organization that has those goals in mind, as opposed to having profit in mind, then the current system with privately owned banks may not actually be the best way to get those goals accomplished.
Right. So that a public bank would not give the school district a fixed rate loan, in other words, if the conditions looked wrong. What are some of the other benefits broadly before we talk about nuts and bolts of getting one of these
Just
set
by
up?
the way, there are many school districts in California that made that same terrible deal
Is that right?
and postponed the payments decades into the future and will go bankrupt.
So we're still sitting on an educational time bomb because of this
Absolutely.
kind of thing?
Oh, sure. Another one, the school district in San Diego took a bond that I think they got $120 million in it from the bond. But when they're all done paying it back, they will have paid back about 850.
8 times what they've paid?
Yeah.
Almost 7 or 8 times?
Yep, it's called a capital appreciation bond.
Somebody appreciates it.
Exactly. I fear bankers bearing gifts.
Yeah, so well put. So give us some real world examples where a public bank would be working on behalf of the public. Say it's the Public Bank of Palo Alto. We're here in Palo Alto.
Palo Alto is probably too small for a public bank.
Is that right?
The county of Santa Clara could have a public bank.
Okay,
The city of San Jose, in partnership with Palo Alto, could do a public bank. There are lots of variations, and we're on the verge of trying out some of those.
Yeah,
around
I
the
do want
state.
to talk about those variations, but let's keep it general so people can come along and get an idea.
Well, here,
Yeah,
I mean,
okay.
to be general, why don't we just say, look, around the world, something like 40% of the banks in the world are actually owned by the government, by whatever government they're in. In some countries, it's as much as 80%, and those are countries like, say, Germany, but also China. The Asian tigers, Taiwan and Taiwan and Singapore, and the economies that have developed in quite a hurry, have often done it by being able to direct finance toward important public goals. They say, look, this is how we want our society to be. This is how we want our economy to progress. We need finance to go there.
Yeah.
Whereas what we do here is we say, we wish our economy would go that way, and we wish that finance would cooperate. And when it doesn't, we say, we wish it would.
Yeah.
Like
We wish the bankers would appreciate us.
would do that. And but that's the issue. I mean, so this is not an uncommon solution in other countries. This is just an uncommon solution in this country.
And I take it these other countries have had public banking for quite some time. This is not a current hot trend or something.
Germany has had what they call Sparkassen banks since the 1930s. That's when they started. And there are 400 of them around the country, and they've financed Germany's very, very rapid conversion to green energy.
Was that a direct response to the Depression being in the 30s?
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so.
So they were seeking shelter by from the global banking system.
But they've kept them,
Yeah, but they've kept them.
and it's worked amazingly well. Another example is that Oakland, for instance, paid $54 million in interest and fees to the Wall Street banks last year.
How much?
$54 million, just in interest and fees. So if instead of having those bonds, Tom was talking about bonds,
Yeah.
if instead of selling those bonds to Wall Street, the city had sold them to the city's bank, the Public Bank of Oakland, the bank could have charged the city a lower interest rate, first of all,
Yeah.
and then would return all that profit back to the city. So the city could borrow from its bank free of charge. It would be free money, essentially.
That,
Or or even if it wasn't free money, I mean, it's certainly it could be, but you could also choose to run a bank where, you might still be paying interest, but the thing is that you're paying it to yourself.
Yeah.
Right, exactly.
Right? And if you're paying it to yourself, well, it's not nearly as painful.
That's true. That's well put. Well, I want to get into the nuts and bolts of some of this, like who finances it and stuff. But I think I want to clarify something. I keep saying because I think a lot of people in here are new to this, but I'm new to this too, quite frankly. So take a moment to talk about the difference between a public bank. We hear about community banks, and I think those are just small, privately owned, locally kind of banks. Credit unions, and now we're talking about postal banking. And I threw a lot there, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but I think it's worth taking some time to compare and contrast on these.
Do you?
I'm delighted you mentioned postal banks. We
Yeah.
had postal banks until 1967, when the Republicans and Wall Street got together and closed them down. And Kristen Gillibrand, has just authored a bill to bring them back, which is wonderful news. And even before that, the Postal Union, APWU, is setting up 4 experimental postal banks in 4 cities, and we're hoping that they will do one in Berkeley, which has had a very active battle to keep its post office open.
Yeah.
So postal banks are a wonderful solution to the unbanked and underbanked.
But are they public banks?
They're public banks, yes.
Okay,
So
because
they
they're
would-
financed by public money. Is it?
Right.
Yeah, okay.
And they're not owned by private investors. They're owned by the United States government.
So a postal bank would bring all these benefits.
It'll take care of the lower part of the lending that a public bank would have a hard time doing.
But they wouldn't be issuing school bonds or
No. It will be small personal accounts.
personal banking.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So
And credit unions and community banks are kind of in the same basket, that they're local, they tend to be much more responsive to community needs. And the only public bank in the country, almost sort of, is the Public Bank of North Dakota, which has been around for 100 years. And it's the model that those of us active in this movement are pretty convinced we're going to follow. And what it does is partner with the community banks and credit unions to issue loans that are bigger than one small community bank can do by itself.
Yeah.
So the community banks in North Dakota love the public bank.
interesting. That's a good point to bring up, because one of my questions is going to be what are the clashes here with the big banks? But we'll get to that in time. North Dakota is the only state.
Well, not
Or
exactly. Samoa just started a public bank. I mean, I'm hesitating because it's just begun.
But I think it's an interesting thing. I mean, American Samoa looked around. They realized that, so American Samoa has 50,000 people on a bunch of islands out in the middle of the Pacific somewhere, that way. And there's not enough people to really make a bank branches worthwhile for big banks, but yet the people in American Samoa need
Banking.
some banking services.
Yeah.
There have been no loans for small businesses for decades.
And so rather,
Really?
Right. Well, there's no bank to make them.
but the important thing is that rather than simply suffer, the government there said, all right, so if this isn't going to happen, we better do it. And they just did. And they did it, they went ahead sort of unimpeded by the ideological blinders that often get in the way of other things. And they just decided, we're going to do this, and they did it. And I actually think that that's a really admirable way to look at public policy. You look at the problem, think of a solution, and just do it.
Yeah. Don't you wish it all worked that way?
It would be so much
It'd be
easier.
so much easier.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we're
fraud.
going to make it work that way.
Okay. Well, let's talk about some of the gears and levers on how this works. You just mentioned Palo Alto probably isn't big enough. So I guess the first question is, how does a public bank get financed? A private bank sells stock, right, to wealthy investors or whatever.
Well, so let's be a little clear.
Yeah.
I mean,
That's what I want to do.
I mean, American Samoa is small,
Yeah,
and they managed to do it.
yeah,
But they did it they did a very special
small.
purpose thing
Yeah.
that was very important to them. That special purpose isn't really relevant to Palo Alto or,
Okay.
areas around here. And so, doing something that has a capacity to, to lend enough to make a difference, that's a place where it's unlikely that, a small city like Palo Alto would be able to come up with enough, with enough capital to be useful. But there's no reason that a small city can't team up with other cities.
yeah.
There are ways to do. I mean, there are ways in California law to do with joint powers authorities, right? JPAs,
Yeah.
and that's one thing to
We've just
do.
done that with energy
Exactly.
around here.
Right.
There are
That's
other.
a very good example,
Thank you.
actually.
Yeah, and then there are other structures too. There's something called a mutual bank, which is it's not a credit union. It's a larger thing, but it's on a very similar model where the bank ownership rests with a certain class of depositors, and so so again there are no shareholders demanding a
Profits.
return.
Yeah.
A friend of mine who recently failed to pull together a mutual bank, not a publicly owned mutual bank, but a different plan. The project failed, and he said, the big problem with a mutual bank is that nobody gets rich. and it's like they say in the software industry, is that a bug or is it a feature?
That's right.
Right, and so that's another potential structure for multiple jurisdictions to
Yeah.
To cooperate.
Yeah.
And the other thing I should say about that is that there is precedent in other spheres to do this. There's right now there's a mutual insurance company that does bond insurance that came out of the National League of Cities. It insures municipal bonds for its members. It's owned by its members, and so there are no shareholders, and they can direct their policy to benefit their members. In the state of Rhode Island, there's an insurance buying co-op that, again, it was a cooperative, mutually owned thing created for the benefit of the cities and towns in the state of Rhode Island. And after a few years of being an insurance buying co-op, they bought a share of an insurance company, and so now they actually underwrite policies.
Yeah.
So they're actually a publicly owned insurance company. So these are not crazy ideas.
Yeah.
These are ideas that practical people have put to practical use, and here's another realm to do it.
Yeah.
But
The bottom line is there's other ways to do banking than what we're
At
currently
better
doing.
ways,
Yeah.
not just other.
Yeah.
Way better.
Better ways.
Better ways. I
Thank
like
you.
that.
That's proper correction. Yeah, much better ways.
And the example that you just mentioned of the power companies, those kinds of combinations of jurisdictions,
Yeah.
we're familiar with in California.
Yeah.
And the Oakland Public Bank has participation from Berkeley, Richmond, and the county of Alameda. So we'll be an example of a coalition.
Oh, yeah. One
Not
of
quite
these joint
sure how
powers.
we're working it out, but
Yeah, we're going to talk about Oakland in a little more detail. So, okay, let's say we're setting up a public bank of Santa Clara County. What happens? Where does the money come from? Does the county just transfer all its bank accounts to this new bank that it just set up? Or let's get a little
there-
into the...
well, first of all, there are two pots of money in
Okay.
every bank. You're going to correct me if I'm wrong here. This is my understanding. One is the
This is his
deposits.
balance sheet chapter, and I kept
Right.
falling.
Right. One is the deposits, and you just described, all of the income of the county of Santa Clara, and probably of the cities in it, and maybe things like the energy company in San Jose, or maybe school districts, maybe water districts. Those are the deposits. That's one pot of money. The other pot of money is the capital, and there are ways to do that. We have a colleague who claims that every jurisdiction has little pockets of money here and there that are just sitting there doing absolutely nothing, that could be used as capital. The model that another colleague uses is the Green Bay Packers, where the entire town of Green Bay was offered shares in the team, and I don't think they get any return on those shares, and they're not allowed to sell them. They have to go down in their family. They have to stay in the family. But the whole town owns the team.
To save the team, I think it was the story way back when.
But I can imagine people in Oakland buying $100 worth of a share in the bank. I think that would be wonderful.
So there's no set way. You could either finance it with government surplus that's sitting in an account, or you could sell shares to the public, and then people in whatever community it is, in this case Santa Clara County, would add to deposits there.
Not individuals, probably.
Well, I mean, it would depend on what you were trying to do at the bank.
Okay.
You know, some banks would not take deposits from individuals. You know, I think by and large, individuals, you know, consumer banking for people above a certain income level are fairly well served. So that might not be a public policy goal that is you know, necessary to pursue. But the city itself has deposits that could be served well. You know, there are, and that might be a transaction account, but it might be an investment account instead. You know, there are a variety of ways that you can imagine it happening, but the goal is basically the same, that you've got these public assets, you have public wealth, you know, our money.
Yeah.
And the point is to deploy it in a way that benefits Santa Clara County, or Palo Alto, or San Jose,
or the individual cities of Santa Clara County.
Right, exactly. But the point is that this is the wealth that belongs to those cities, and how best to deploy it, as opposed to the situation now where you put it in Wells Fargo or Bank of America, and it goes and finances construction projects in Dubai, or, you know, pipelines somewhere else. You know, I mean, those are
in North Dakota.
Just for example. Just for example.
Yeah.
But that's the key thing, is that you're looking for ways to deploy public assets on behalf of the public.
Yeah. So I'm going back to Tom's first story, where this guy was embezzling from a bank, and he was on the board of directors or board of governors of the insurance company. Who's going to be on the board of a county public bank? Where's the governance? How's that?
We have rapidly discovered that is the main issue, who is on the board. And we've put together, we spent those of us in Oakland, Friends of the Public Bank of Oakland, my shirt says that somewhere here.
You're far enough along that you've got the T-shirts. Okay.
Well, I was going to say, the reason I wore the T-shirt is you have to start with T-shirts. That makes you look like it's happening already.
Right.
I mean, when I wear this T-shirt, people say, "Oh, is there a public bank?" And then we get into a conversation. So begin with T-shirts. San Francisco just got theirs. It's I forgot what you asked me now.
About governance.
Oh, well, we've spent 4 or 5 of the last months putting together a governance plan, looking at 25 different documents, from, for instance, Mondragon, the worker co-op city in Spain, which has interesting governance, and worker co-ops in general. Other banks, the Bank of North Dakota, obviously, as many different documents as we could get that are imaginative and would give us ideas about what our bank should look like. And right now we're at a sort of a crisis point, because one of the consultants that we've been working with said our imaginative, very community representative bank won't fly.
Too much community representation.
The agencies won't approve it. So we're going to have to convince him that this is a workable plan, and then we're going to have to convince the regulatory agencies, and that it will be a challenge because it's very different from a profit-making bank.
Yeah.
But you know, the important thing too is, I mean, there is the governance of the bank itself, but there's also, you know, which involves setting the policy goals of the bank and running it. But there's also, which I think speaks more to the, or not more to the question, but also speaks to the question that you're asking. None of these things are going to exist without an independent regulator overseeing it. You know, there is going to be regulation, probably from the state bank regulators, and it's going to be independent and rigorous.
Yeah.
So what the problem?
So it'll have overseers just like private banks and credit unions.
Exactly.
Same
and all
departments.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The same regulators, the same regulatory formula, to, you know, the capital ratios that they use to decide is this bank a solid one or is this a risky one? I mean, those are part of the mix,
And that should be reassuring to the public.
exactly, and it'll be an independent one, unlike the example that you said in Rhode Island, where it was like the opposite of independent.
Let's not do it that way.
Yeah, counterexamples are easy.
What's the governance structure of Bank of North Dakota?
It has a 3-member board. The governor is one member. The chair of the agriculture department. Do you know who the third is? I forget.
But they're from the government.
They're government.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, the North Dakota Bank is basically the state doing business as a bank. Like it isn't even an independent corporation. But you know, it benefits from being 100 years old, and or 99 years old at this point. You know, if I can digress just briefly, I mean, the North Dakota Bank is the product of the progressive populists of the Upper Midwest, you know, who gave us Robert La Follette, William Jennings Bryan, and
The Nonpartisan League.
yeah, they were going to free the farmers of North Dakota from the ravages of the Eastern financial elite, right?
Right.
And
That was on their T-shirt.
that way, exactly. They founded the bank. You know, it was tremendously controversial at the time. And it was the subject of a ruthless campaign against it, which the progressive populists who founded the bank lost, right? So they founded the bank, then they lost the governorship and control of the legislature over the bank.
Wow.
But the Republicans who came in, having vowed to shut the thing down, once they had control of it, they were like, huh,
This works pretty well.
this could be useful. And they ran it, and they have run it ever since. And you know, it's a completely practical way to do the state's business, and so it has persisted over 100 years. Now, it's 100 years later. The world is a pretty different place than when it was founded, but I think there's a lot of inspiration that can be taken from the model of you see a problem. You come up with a solution, and you just do it.
And you do it.
They also started, at the same point, the Nonpartisan League started a grain elevator, a public grain elevator, which still exists to this day, 100 years later. And there's a wonderful movie about that whole movement called Northern Lights that was made by a Berkeley film producer.
Northern Lights. Well, let's
Northern
keep
Lights.
that in mind. I do want to get to the audience for questions, because they're always an important part of this. But give us a quick thumbnail of your efforts in Oakland. You have a fairly large group working on this. What have you been through? What are the steps that it's taken, and how far along are you in 30 seconds or so?
We started with 2 or 3 of us, like most movements. Had held some public events, public workshops. Tom was at the first one, I think, one of our panelists. That got us more people. Our group grew. We had to move from a coffee shop to a real meeting room, those wonderful growing pains. And we already had pretty good relationships with most of our city council members. Most of us have been activists for decades and know those people well. Then it was a question of getting as many community groups to sign on in support of us as possible. And when we put all their names on a letter to the city council, we also use their logos, so it's very it's visually, graphically effective.
So essentially, just like any other grassroots movement, growing it from the ground up and spreading it out and bringing more people in.
We went to farmers markets. We have, I think, 2,500 signatures from people. We've handed out all kinds of literature.
Well, how far along are the decision makers in coming along with you at this point?
A year and a half ago, the City Council passed a resolution requesting the administration to issue a request for proposals for a feasibility study. Year and a half ago.
Yeah.
That feasibility study was turned in a couple of weeks ago, finally.
Yeah.
And we're waiting for it to be approved by staff and the City Council.
Yeah.
And the next step will be a business plan. We're raising money for the business plan. We hope to have Tom help write it. And that plan will include applications to the regulatory agencies for a charter, a license. Then we'll start the bank.
So the ball is rolling in Oakland for a public bank.
We're further along than any place in the country right now.
And where else are there significant movements right now? There's something happening in San Francisco, I understand. Is that right?
There's a task forces meeting in San Francisco. There's activity in Los Angeles. Again, the city is putting together a feasibility study. The city of Seattle is in the process of doing a feasibility study that's due in August.
Portland.
Portland, I'm not exactly sure what's happening, but there is...
they issued an RFP.
Is there?
I think.
There's actually a project happening in New York City and in Washington.
In New York City?
I don't believe the city has officially acted yet, but there's but again, there's a well-organized band of activists.
Troublemakers,
yes, exactly. Working there as well. And
Santa Fe was the city most in the lead in the country. They did a feasibility study 2 years ago that said, yes, a bank is feasible. And then they put together a task force to do the business plan, and they've just issued their report saying we just didn't have the resources to do a business plan. We didn't have the money or the time or the expertise. And we probably, in fact, think there should be a state bank and not a Bank of Santa Fe. So that was a setback. That's disappointing.
I do want to get to the audience, but are there any other state banks bubbling at all?
The guy who just became elected governor of New Jersey ran. Phil Murphy ran with that as part of his platform.
Really? That's right.
So it's a campaign promise, and we're sort of waiting to see what actually happens from it. But
he's been doing a pretty good job of fulfilling campaign promises so far, I think.
So we all have high hopes.
There's legislation in not Kansas, but what's next door to Kansas? Missouri.
Interesting.
State legislation, and I think maybe in either Wisconsin or Michigan, I forget.
Yeah.
But it's bubbling up.
Yeah, I don't think Kansas, after their Republican budget experiments, has enough money left to buy lunch, let alone finance a public bank. All right, let's get the audience in on this. Steffi will be coming around with the microphone. Just hold up your hand, and when she does arrive, please stand up to make it easier on our camera operators. And a full room and no questions. We're in trouble because we got 20 minutes to go. Okay, here we go. It's just who's going to be first. And hold that mic right up there.
This is a question about the Public Banking Institute. Do you relate to them at all in your Oakland project? I've heard a lot of their ideas. They've been at this for 3 or 4 years, as far as I remember. And one of the ladies that's at the top of that is named Ellen Brown. And so you're nodding some recognition there. How do you relate to them, and how are they helping, or how are they not?
they've been around for 8 years, maybe 9 at this point, and I worked for them for a while. I got a little impatient with them. I'm not a very patient person, and several of us moved from PBI to start Commonomics. We maintain a very close relationship. I mean, they're still my old friends. Ellen is a good friend. It's not as though there's a gigantic number of public bank enthusiasts, and we kind of stick together.
Your impatience, though, what was that about? Can you explain?
They just weren't willing to move as aggressively as we wanted them to. We thought the time was ripe, and they didn't, and we were right.
Okay, thank you for the question. Right here in front.
Yeah, it's a two-part question. Wondered if you've faced any opposition from the banking industry, banking lobbyists at this early stage in the history. And secondly, I wondered if you could speak to some of the biggest proponents. I know that California, Colorado, Washington that have big cannabis industries but are unable to move the money because the federal laws prohibiting it, have a keen interest in public banks. And I wonder if you could speak to that constituency, if there's other constituencies that would be logical advocates for public banks.
Good.
Yeah.
What?
So the opposition so far from larger banks has largely been along the lines of, wait, we do that already. What do you need that for? I wouldn't say that there has been, active intervention to prevent. Most of what I'm aware of has been along those lines, just a fairly, aren't we enough for you kind of thing. And as far as cannabis goes, I do think that that's a place where there are banks in other states that are successfully banking cannabis cash. Here is a place where the public policy goals are not necessarily shared by the banks, right? The public policy goal that these potential buyers of banking services cannot find a seller. That's something that the existing banks in California seem unwilling to step in. In other states, they have stepped in. There are tools that are available to make it relatively safe for them, but they don't feel the demand for deposits is large enough to be worth the trouble. But again, this is a place where here's a public policy goal, and here's an unwillingness of finance to act. You can either suffer, or you can just do it. And so I think there is quite a bit of potential for public institutions to facilitate a solution to the problem.
We intend to take cannabis cash, not immediately, but as soon as we're established. One of our strongest advocates is the co-founder of Harborside Health Center, which is the biggest dispensary in the universe, I'm told. So we're strongly allied with the cannabis industry, and they support us publicly. Back in 2011, there was a bill at the state legislature calling for a feasibility study, and we don't know why the governor vetoed it, Brown, but we kind of think it might have been the big banks then. They haven't stepped forward, as Tom said, yet, but our strategy is to split the banking industry put a wedge between the community banks and credit unions and the big Wall Street banks. We know the Wall Street banks won't like us, but community banks should love us. And so usually the banking industry, the banking associations speak as one voice, and we're trying to split them so that the big banks have less power, so that legislatures will hear from community banks and say, this is good for our locality.
Okay, while the mic gets over there, I had some questions emailed to me, and one of them kind of follows up on that. When completely scaled up, would cities and states be able to cut out private banks altogether?
So, in order to be useful, any public bank is going to be part of the existing network of banks, right? I mean, it would not make sense for a bank
To
to
recreate the ecology, so to speak.
Yeah, it would not make sense for a bank to try to imagine itself apart from from the network of existing banks. But what it will be instead is a member of that network, but a member that has a kind of a democratic accountability baked into it from the beginning. But I don't think that you can say that it would be separate from the rest. So I don't think that it's right to say that it'll displace private banks, but it will take the point is to take public assets and deploy them on behalf of the public.
And out of the private banks and get around this having to go hat in hand to the private bank to...
Or at least, I mean, even if you can't completely get around it, go to them with a little more clout.
That's true.
Right? I mean, that
helps.
I mean, that's another way to do the same thing, right?
That's an excellent point, yeah.
I mean, you can, if you can displace part of what that bank would do for you, you have a little bit more clout when you're bargaining over a rate, right? So these are ways to say, okay, look, we're not just customers. We're customers who own a lot of money, and that entitles us to much better service than we're getting, and that's the plan.
Yeah.
Right now, big cities are trapped. Our accounts are too big to divest into smaller banks. We'd love to leave the Wall Street banks. The city of Oakland hates Chase. That's where our money is right now. I mean, we really hate them. I mean, I'm talking city council, administration, all of them. But there's we have no choice.
Yeah.
So with the public bank, we will have a serious choice.
Yeah, I think some local activists ran into that with Palo Alto when they were trying to get them to divest and get money out of Wells Fargo, and they were told we can't do that. You know,
Right.
we might agree with the concept, but it's just impractical.
Right.
Right.
Okay, let's get back to where's the next question. Thank you.
Hi. Susan, I saw you kind of shake your head in disappointment again when the Santa Fe task force decided that the state bank would be a better option. And I know that in previous discussions you've mentioned a web of community banks and perhaps a state bank as well. Can you talk to the relationship that a web like that would have and how a state bank would help community banks thrive, if that's what you're thinking?
Like community banks, you mean local public banks?
Yeah, local Santa Clara or San
Municipal
Jose.
banks.
Yeah, exactly.
Regional banks.
Thank you.
Some of us have different opinions about that. I'm very skeptical about a state bank, and I supported the work we did back in 2011 because I'm worried about governance. I think it's so far from the people that we just won't have any control over it at all. There are people who say the Bank of California would be the biggest bank in the world. So it's tempting. That kind of power is tempting, but I really worry about governance.
Interesting, yeah. A problem of scale. Do you have a thought about this?
Well,
when you scale up to the state level, do you lose some of the benefits of a municipal or more local?
Well, I mean, if the point is to be responsive to the local community, then yeah, certainly there is a risk in doing that. I mean, it would be a shame to found a Bank of California and have something that was only as responsive as Chase. It's not to say that governance challenges like that cannot be overcome, but it is something to it is something to bear in mind as you're trying to construct a large thing.
Okay, I think we got another one here in the audience. Hold it up close.
Thanks for all the great work you're doing. So you said that the purpose of public banks is to use the public assets for public good. So it seems like there's a lot of allies for that because a lot of activist organizers are trying to do things for public good. So how are you doing in trying to make public bank a prominent plank for environmental justice, for healthcare, for education, for affordable housing?
Good question.
Well, I think that one way to do that is that a lot of those movements have financing needs. Clean energy development is a financeable need. Affordable housing is certainly one. These are places where, or climate resilience is another one. In case you think that it's just not going to work. These are all places where having a source of financing would further the goals of those movements by quite a bit. And I think it's something that the activists who care about those issues should educate themselves about and lend their voices. Because right now, public banking seems a little bit exotic and a little bit like a peculiar sort of obsession of a small band of people. Sorry. But
they have T-shirts, Tom.
Right. But the point is that it's something that could be deployed in service of a large number of goals. Finance in a large way rules our world, and to the extent that we can look at that and notice it and do something about it. I am encouraged by the divest movement. The people who are looking at the construction of the pipeline and tying it back to what's actually going on, which is to say that our wealth, our public assets, are being used in service of making the climate worse. And so step one is acknowledging that, and then step two is harnessing those assets to make it better. Call me a dreamer, right? But it would be nice. But I think there is a lot of room for people to start acknowledging that those are the strings that tie these issues together, and to say, yeah, come on with us, help it out.
The way I talk about it is that we're not just another silo. We're the money that can finance all the silos. So we're the solution to all of those problems, or one of the solutions. None of them can be solved without money, and we're money. And what we've been doing is reaching out to those different silos, and we've held we had a huge event featuring the Sparkassen, one of the people from the Sparkassen banks in Germany, along with all the activists who put together the CCA in Alameda County. And he talked about how the public banks in Germany finance their clean energy conversion. We had an event with Gail McLaughlin talking about student debt, right? We will have one about housing and mobilize the housing community. So reaching out to those communities and at first telling them who we are and how we can be helpful is absolutely critical.
All right, excellent question. Anybody who hasn't asked a question yet, we have just a few minutes left. Okay, back up here, and then we're going to have to wrap up.
Well, the initial impetus, I think, will rightly come from social justice, environmental justice, housing groups like that. It seems to me a logical win for conservatives that seem to favor small government over big government, local control. I would think that keeping interest payments in the local community where it can be put back into housing, cash-strapped city and county governments that are looking for new sources of revenue. I would hope that the conservatives would be next in line to step up and say, yes, we want public banks right here in our community. And I wondered if there's been any early olive branches or early connections made from the conservative wing as well as the progressive wing.
Did we mention that North Dakota has a public bank? John Hoeven, the esteemed senator from North Dakota, got his start in politics as president of the public bank there. Public banking is actually an issue where you can find very conservative people who think that this is a perfectly sensible thing to do. So sure, it's already there.
The community bankers that we've been reaching out to tend to be Republicans.
Okay, thank you. Good question. I may be getting myself in a little trouble here, but I was told before we started rolling the tape that Susan had brought along a surprise prop, and apparently I didn't ask the proper question for her to spring this on me.
Well,
but
I didn't.
I'm dying to know.
I didn't prompt you.
And quickly, we have about 2.5 minutes left.
So we went to our city council over and over again, and every time we thought it was like the fairy tale about the prince who comes and wants to marry the king's daughter, and the king says, go kill the dragon on the east side of town. He's been murdering all kinds of people. And the prince goes and kills the dragon and says, okay, can I marry your daughter now? And the king says, now there's a dragon on the east side of town, go, then you can have my daughter. And it just felt like that over and over again. They raised one objection after another, most of which were idiotic, and we did every single one. I mean,
slayed all those dragons.
We slayed all those dragons. And so the last time that we came before the city council, they had asked us to go find money to finance. They'd promised us $100,000 for the feasibility study, and then they said, no, we'll give you 75.
Get to it.
We'll give you 75, go find the rest. And we did, and we came back with the rest. And at that point, I said, we've done all this, and we have slayed the last dragon. That's it. We're done with dragons.
All
Here
right.
it is. Give us our bank.
Thank you. That was worth waiting for. Tom, 30 seconds. What should people take home from here tonight? What can they do if they're interested? Where should they read more?
30 seconds. All right. So there's a reason to do this that is important to Palo Alto, is important to Santa Clara, is important to San Jose, but there's a bigger reason to do it too. When you're faced with a landscape of unaccountable financial institutions, one possible response is to try to regulate them harder. There are thousands of people working to do that, and there are twice as many thousands of people working to prevent them. But another possible way to seek financial reform is just to build better financial institutions, to build institutions that have democracy baked into them from the very beginning. What I've been suggesting to people is that I want a little more democracy in our finance, and I also want a little less finance in our democracy.
Okay, that's a good line. We're going to leave it there. Thanks for joining us. This is Other Voices. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you.
Susan.
Thank you.
And thank you all.